everyone, and I'm here for another Victober video, specifically talking about Elizabeth Gaskell and George Eliot. I wasn't even planning on doing this, but I read an article this morning that I will link down below. There is a newsletter that's free that you can get called Wallflower, and I really enjoy it. It has a whole variety of topics. There's usually one bookish article in the weekly newsletter that comes out. Sometimes they just do things with fashion, they'll do things with movies, just kind of arts and culture generally. And this article was on how Adam Bede taught me to find hope, something along those lines. And I know that I had talked about in the other video kind of ranking George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell, and I think they both fall under the domestic realism category. But it just struck me as I was reading this article, there are some amazing similarities between Adam Bede and Wives and Daughters. And I also didn't realize they were so similar in length. For some reason, Adam Bede feels shorter to me, and I think it's because it is more plot driven. And so Adam Bede has, I wrote this down, okay, 624 pages. And it is finished. And Wives and Daughters has 679 pages and is unfinished. Now, this first section of the video, I will keep spoiler free for you. And then I will have a timestamp. I'll have it labeled down below when I get into the spoiler section. Basically, I realized that the 5 main characters from the younger generation, it's very easy to compare and contrast them. So we have Dinah Morris in Adam Bede, and then we have Molly Gibson. They are both kind of the moral paragons. What's interesting is, though, Wives and Daughters is very much an upper class story, and Adam Bede is definitely a lower class or middle class story. Some of the characters are lower class, but they aren't main characters. The main characters in it are all middle class, with one exception in Adam Bede. And then, so they are, like I said, these kind of moral paragons, and they are kind of written as these ideal Victorian women. But the way they are ideal is very different. I think Dinah doesn't necessarily fit the traditional Victorian notions of femininity, because she is a female preacher, which is really fascinating. The book opens up with Dinah preaching. She's a Methodist preacher. And that's such a unique feature to have in a Victorian novel. But both she and Molly are softer spoken and are just thought to be reliable. And the beauty that they have is not a beauty that kind of catches you off guard, like Cynthia or Hetty Sorrel. And so they are kind of these girl next door type beauties. They are very beautiful, but it doesn't kind of sweep men away like the beauty of the other 2 characters, Hetty and Cynthia. And so then Hetty and Cynthia, I feel, are a bit of foils to Molly and Dinah. Hetty is worldly, and she is very just discontent, having a kind of mundane everyday life and helping out with domestic tasks. She's not interested in that, and she wants pretty shiny things. She loves to look at herself in the looking glass. And so it's abundantly clear, here is Hetty. She's very vain. Don't be like Hetty. And then Cynthia, who I feel Gaskell comes down a little bit less hard on vanity. Cynthia is very beautiful, but she doesn't actually do much to make herself beautiful. Whereas it seems that Hetty kind of spent more time on her looks. And I think part of that might be how George Eliot viewed herself and her own vanity. She was not really considered by many people to be a beautiful woman. And so maybe there was a little bit of resentment for women that were able to, spend some time on themselves and then get noticed and admired by many. Also, Cynthia's beauty is very effortless. Cynthia puts on an outfit and it just, falls on her exactly the right way. It flows. She is just an exquisite beauty. So there is a little bit of difference there. It seems like Cynthia, yes, she's very beautiful, but she doesn't actually put that much effort into it. It is more kind of her persona, her just the kind of atmosphere that she puts out. Whereas Hetty puts in a lot of time to her looks and is very vain. That's conveyed in the book. Then we have Seth and Osborne. Now, Seth gets a lot less kind of on the page time than Osborne Hamley. I find Seth not that interesting of a character. And I'd say that, Roger Hamley is the more main character that's focused on as opposed to Osborne. And then Adam Bede, obviously, he's the title character, so he's focused on more than Seth. But Seth and Adam are kind of oil and water, and the same thing with Roger and Osborne. And what I love about both of those relationships is even though the brothers have opposite personalities, they are oil and water, they both have utmost respect for one another. They know that they don't expect them to be exactly alike. Roger doesn't think that Osborne has to be exactly like him. Adam doesn't think Seth has to be exactly like him. I do think that I wish Seth, I got to know him better. Because both times that I've read Adam Bede, he's not a character that sticks out a whole lot to me. And then, like I said, Adam and Roger, and they both have kind of a wisdom beyond their years. But Roger seems to have that more from the get-go, from the very beginning of the book. He has that wisdom beyond his years. He's an old soul and has a great perspective, and he's even-keeled, and he knows that he wants to be useful in the world. And Adam, he does kind of... he has more kind of reckless abandon when he becomes infatuated, and he gets a bit more carried away with his emotions. And you see this in one very tumultuous scene, which I'll talk about in the spoiler section. Roger is much more quick on his feet and even-keeled, like I had said. He's less passionate, and so then this means that he doesn't kind of fly off the handle like Adam might in certain instances. And then lastly, we have Arthur Donnithorne and Mr. Preston. It will be tricky to talk about these characters without spoilers, so I will just briefly say that I think that Adam Bede feels much more a high-stakes story, and Wives and Daughters feels very safe. This world is very safe. The things that happen that are upsetting in Wives and Daughters seem like sad things that could happen in the life of anyone that you knew. Whereas in Adam Bede, it would be this extraordinarily tragic thing. If you heard, you would say, oh my goodness, like what, how did that happen? How could someone let that happen? You wouldn't think that it would happen to someone that you would know. But of course, these things do happen, but I'm just saying that I feel that Wives and Daughters feels kind of more relatable as far as the day-to-day events that happen. And I think that because Wives and Daughters is a safer world than kind of these guys who are morally gray, Mr. Preston in Wives and Daughters is definitely, he is more moral. And he is, he just has a higher standard of behavior. Whereas Arthur Donnithorne, he is less moral, much less moral, and much more self-involved. I think Mr. Preston does have a lot of selfishness about him, but it is not taken to nearly the same degree as Arthur Donnithorne. Mr. Preston, I would still say, is a gentleman. And later on in the book, when he is critiqued and Molly says, you know, you haven't partaken in gentlemanly behavior, he takes that very seriously. He's very bothered by her saying that. Okay, so I think that is the extent of the non-spoilery discussion. So I will just jump into the spoilery part. So then, jumping back to Arthur Donnithorne and Mr. Preston, what Mr. Preston does is he finds a impressionable young lady and gets her to agree, when she's not really ready to agree, that she will marry him one day. And then he keeps pressing her and having, secret meetings with her. He doesn't, for one, I am actually, the more I read Wives and Daughters, the more sympathetic I am to him, because he doesn't rake her reputation over the coals. The only reason that it comes out is because of other people in the town gossiping. He does not bring it up. He does not slander Cynthia. And I think he definitely gets some character points for that. Contrasted with Arthur Donnithorne, who is having this secret rendezvous with Hetty Sorrel and involved in very ungentlemanly behavior because of an act that they do together, then Hetty is left an unwed mother. And that is just social suicide in that time. And so he has a sexual relationship with her, and then he just leaves. He has no forethought that maybe she will be pregnant from our relationship, or he just doesn't care and he leaves. And it's, there were standards at the time of how a gentleman should behave. And so if he was engaging in a sexual relationship with her, it should be he was going to marry her very, very soon. And he doesn't do that. He just leaves and he has no thought for the consequences. Whereas Mr. Preston would never think of having a sexual relationship with Cynthia outside of her name being protected by a marriage. And I think that's a really important contrast between those two. And I don't know if it's either maybe George Eliot being somewhat cynical, kind of thinking, this is what men are like. But I do know she had two very positive romantic relationships, even though the first one was pretty tumultuous for her reputation because she was living with a married man. I don't necessarily think it's cynical. I think it's being realistic about Victorian society, and the hypocrisy was there. And then within her own romantic relationship, she, like I said, was with a married man, and so had been written off by society. It was scandalous she was with a married man, but yet her partner, George Henry Lewis, the married man, but not to her, would get invited to operas and concerts, and she would not be invited, George Eliot herself. So there is this real double standard and hypocrisy there. Now, so the two secrets that are in the books, Cynthia's big secret is that she is secretly engaged to Mr. Preston, and she's trying desperately to break off that engagement, whereas Hetty has this secret pregnancy. And what is very interesting is the two ways that the secrets are revealed in the books. In Wives and Daughters, it's really hinted at. That something is a brew, something is happening. You don't know quite what the first time you're experiencing the story. Cynthia says at one point, what would you think if I married someone like Mr. Preston? Like, it's this hypothetical scenario, and she brings it up to Molly, and Molly says, Mr. Preston, why would you bring him up? And every time Mr. Preston is in a scene, he's on the page, there is tension in the air, and you don't know why exactly. But then contrasted with a secret pregnancy, Hetty's secret pregnancy. And this is, so she goes months and months hiding this pregnancy. And I could just imagine her kind of taking out the hems in her dresses to try to hide her growing belly. Although with her first pregnancy, maybe it wasn't showing that much for a long time. But what's interesting is there is not really much information that you are given about Hetty and Arthur Donnithorne's relationship. That they are, that she kind of lights up whenever she sees him. You know that he kind of likes to flatter her, but you have no idea that their relationship is of a sexual nature. It's just so shocking. And I think actually it's a really impressive storytelling technique to find out all of a sudden, you're through the perspective of Adam, you're hearing that Hetty Sorrel has murdered her baby. And I remember thinking, did I miss some chapters, and flipping back? And so it's very shocking, and it's an extremely effective storytelling technique. I'll never forget how surprised I was. Now, what's interesting is that it is such a harrowing story, right? This young woman who is unwed, and then out of desperation, she murders a baby. It's based on a real event that George Eliot's aunt told her about. So it was a case that really happened. Now, in Wives and Daughters, you spend much more time with Molly Gibson, who would be the Dinah of Adam Bede. So it's much more female-oriented story. What's interesting is these are, Adam Bede and Wives and Daughters are both written by female authors, but in Adam Bede, you're spending much more time with Adam as a character. And I feel that I know Molly from Wives and Daughters and Adam Bede the most. Those are the characters that I feel I get to know the most in those stories. And they are both brilliant, nuanced characters. Brilliant, nuanced characters. Now, at the end of the story, right, when Mr. Preston, the engagement is broken off, once the engagement, he sends Cynthia her letters. Once that is dealt with, once it's broken off, he really fades into the background. You don't hear about him. And maybe it's because the events that involved him just were less significant. This broken engagement. Engagements can be broken. It was a thing even in the Victorian era that engagements were broken. It was, people would gossip about it for a little while, but then it was done. Well, then contrast this with Arthur Donnithorne getting Hetty Sorrel pregnant and just taking no responsibility until it was far too late after she had murdered their baby. And he is much more sobered, and he shows some humility. And that is, I think he makes for a much more interesting character. He's much more detestable, but I do find him more interesting than Mr. Preston. Now, what's interesting is in Adam Bede, the older generation, so the parents of these younger people or aunts and uncles, the older generation is a lot more distant. Whereas in Wives and Daughters, sometimes I feel you spend as much time with the older generation as you do with the younger. In addition to this, I think a note that I forgot to say about Hetty and Cynthia is that Cynthia doesn't have a father, and she does talk about how she really resents her mother for sending her to boarding school at 4 years old, which every time I hear that, my heart breaks for her. 4 years old. And then contrasting that with Hetty, who has no parents. She is an orphan. She does live with a loving aunt and uncle, but maybe this extra sense of even more kind of aloneness makes her desperate to really change her life. Whereas Cynthia seems like she really wants to change her life. She's isolated from her mother, and she makes the terrible decision to become engaged at 15 years old. So that is an interesting thing to think about. And I think that's basically all I had to say. I just thought it was interesting. Once I thought about it, there are actually a number of similarities. So for those of you that have made it through this whole video that have read both, let me know what you think. And if there's other parallels you would like to add to this discussion. Thank you as always for watching, and I will be back with another video soon. Bye.